Belief isn't as simple as an inspirational quote. It becomes a silent battle between the mind that says impossible and the soul that whispers, there's still a way. Unstoppable people aren't born confident. They only learn to force themselves to believe a little more each day, until belief became instinct. They don't need the world to prove they can, because they've already proven it to themselves through action. In today's video, we will explore the journey. Force yourself to believe in yourself and become unstoppable. This isn't a motivational speech or hollow encouragement. It's an honest conversation about how to reclaim the power stolen by doubt, by looking straight into fear, listening to your soul, and acting even before belief arrives. If you're tired of doubting yourself, if you feel you're standing at the edge, half wanting to believe, half wanting to give up, then this video is for you. Because perhaps what you need isn't more motivation, but one truth. Faith doesn't come when you're ready. It comes when you begin. Are you ready to begin this journey? Number 1. When doubt becomes the soul's habit. There are mornings when you wake up, look into the mirror, not sad, not happy, just haunted by a vague feeling. You're existing, but not truly alive. You touch your face, and for a moment, something passes like mist over your soul. You don't know what you want anymore. You're not even sure who you are. Everything seems fine, yet somewhere deep inside, a small voice asks, how long have I been lost from myself? Carl Jung once wrote, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." Perhaps that's how doubt slips in, not as a storm, but as a quiet drizzle, repeating itself day after day. A drop from a criticism at 17, a drop from a failure at work, a drop from the judging gaze of someone you loved. Slowly, these drops merge into an underground stream that silently erodes the bedrock of faith. You no longer say, "I can't," aloud, but you feel it in every move. When opportunity knocks, you hesitate. When someone compliments you, you deflect it. When a new idea sparks, you crush it with, "I'm not ready yet." The danger isn't doubting yourself once. It's when doubt becomes the soul's default mode. Jung believed that most emotions are not truly emotional, but habitual unconscious programs. When you doubt yourself long enough, the brain starts choosing that route automatically. It's no longer a decision, it's a reflex. A dangerous one, because it makes you believe smallness is your nature. When doubt becomes a groove in your mind, it doesn't just shape how you think, it sculpts how you feel and act. From once daring, you become avoidant. From once believing, you become controlling. Every intention gets blocked by the question, "Am I enough?" And within that hesitation, your life force leaks away. This is where psychology meets the soul, where if you don't force yourself to believe, you'll be pulled backward into the past, reliving the same doubts that once broke you. Belief isn't born naturally. It's built through discipline, through choosing yourself again and again each time the old fear returns. Like someone once burned by fire who now recoils at even the sight of light, doubt no longer stems from fear of failure, but from memory of it. And if unseen, that memory keeps writing your future. Jung called it the shadow memory, the dark recollection that directs us from behind the curtain. A young woman once said she had never dared to post a photo of herself online, not because she thought she was unattractive, but because she believed, "People will laugh." One day she wrote that sentence down. People will laugh. Then she stared at it. Slowly she realized those people never existed. It was just a voice in her head, repeating something someone else had once said to her. From that day, she broke the spell. She posted her first photo, trembling, heart pounding, and nothing bad happened. Instead, she felt warmth spreading inside, not because others praised her, but because of the first time she stood on her own side. Doubt disguises itself skillfully. It doesn't shout, "You're worthless." It whispers, "Wait a bit longer. It's not the right time. Others are better." It traps you in the gray zone, not desperate enough to quit, but not confident enough to begin. You don't fall, you freeze. And that stillness kills more dreams than any failure ever could. If you look closely, you'll see that doubt is like fog. It doesn't kill you, it just blinds you. And Jung's reminder is this: fog isn't real. You've simply forgotten you're standing under sunlight. In Jungian therapy, one way to overcome self-doubt is to return to self-observation. Instead of saying, "I am a person without faith," you say, "I am experiencing a moment of not having faith." The difference lies in one word: am versus am experiencing. When you say, "I am," you define yourself by doubt. When you say, "I am experiencing," you observe it, like a cloud passing by. And in that awareness, its power fades. Jung compared the human mind to a garden. Every thought is a seed. If you sow "I can't" daily, your field will soon be full of weeds. But if you begin to plant, "I am learning to believe in myself," you'll be surprised to see the first small flowers bloom where you once saw wasteland. I remember a friend once said, "I can never believe in myself." I was born without confidence. I asked her, "Were you truly born that way? Or have you just heard it so many times that you mistook it for truth?" She went silent, then laughed. That was the moment she realized the one saying "I can't" wasn't her. And that's the first step of belief. Realizing the voice that holds you back isn't the world. It's the one you've trusted for too long. Jung called this process making the unconscious conscious. When you look directly at the voice, it loses its grip. When you ask it, "Who put you in my head?" it has no answer. From there, things begin to shift. Not through a grand leap, but through small movements. You speak up once in a meeting, you post that first photo, you walk into the room you once thought you didn't belong in. Those small actions are the first bricks of trained belief, not blind faith, but incremental trust. Remember, doubt is the reflex of the mind, but belief is the choice of the soul. And every time you choose belief, even by 1%, your soul brightens a little more. You don't have to force yourself to be strong today. Just start by standing on your own side, even if the rest of the world doesn't. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." When you stop seeking reasons outside to believe and begin looking inward to reignite the forgotten flame, you'll realize the strength you're searching for isn't in the future. It's right where you sit, in this very breath. And that's the moment the soul begins to clear its fog. Because sometimes, to become unstoppable, you don't need to be sure of everything. You just need to stop doubting yourself. Number 2, the battle between ego and self. Something strange happens after you realize the voice saying "you can't" isn't really yours. You think you've broken free from doubt, but days later, another voice arises, subtler, more persuasive. It no longer says, "You're not good enough." It whispers, "What if you're just delusional?" That's when the real battle begins. Because doubt isn't just a habit, it's the ego's favorite weapon, designed to keep you safe within the familiar, the controllable. Carl Jung taught that within each person, two centers coexist, the ego and the self. The ego is what you usually think you are, the part that wants control, worries, plans, fears rejection, or judgment. It's the gatekeeper asking, "Is this safe? What will people think?" The self, on the other hand, is deeper, the true soul, the source of peace, creativity, intuition, and meaning. The self doesn't care whether you meet anyone's standards. It only wants you to live truthfully, to experience and evolve. Simply put, ego wants safety, self wants freedom. And most inner conflicts between wanting authenticity and fearing mistakes come from their opposition. Each time you're about to step out of your comfort zone, to try, to trust, to follow excitement, the ego appears. It doesn't scream, it rationalizes. The market's saturated. It's too early. Others are better. Wait a bit longer. Ego doesn't wish to destroy you. It thinks it's protecting you from pain, failure, or ridicule. But when it dominates too long, it doesn't just shield you from danger, it blocks you from growth. Jung said the true psychological journey begins when you can distinguish the voice of ego from that of the self. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." In other words, if you can't recognize when ego is driving, you'll mistake fear for logic, defense for caution, and the silence of the soul for stability. But you're not living truth, you're just obeying fear. I once met a woman named Emma during a group session. She was a talented designer, but after years in a large company, she felt empty. She wanted to start her own brand, but her ego kept blocking her. What if you fail? People will laugh. She waited for the right time. 3 years passed. That time never came. One day her therapist asked, "Who is saying, 'I'm not ready,' you or your fear?" The question pierced her silence. She realized she'd been living to protect her ego, not herself. The next day, she resigned. Not because she was sure of success, but because she couldn't bear to imprison her soul another day. A year later, her brand thrived, not by luck, but because she had chosen self. Modern neuroscience confirms what Jung intuited. When you doubt or fear, the amygdala, your brain's fear center, activates, triggering overthinking, delay, or freeze. But when you act despite fear, your basal ganglia, the habit center, rewires itself, creating new responses. In other words, action is the only way to reprogram belief. You can't think your way out of doubt. You must move to teach your brain, "I survived, even when I was scared." Jung called this the experiment of the soul. Inside you, two forces pull at once. Ego wants safety, self wants growth. This battle unfolds in small daily decisions, speaking up, trying again, admitting your worth. Forcing yourself to believe doesn't mean denying fear. It means letting self take the wheel. You don't need to erase ego. You simply say, "Thank you for protecting me, but I'll drive now." Ego isn't evil, only dangerous when you identify with it. Leave it in control too long, and you'll live your life inside a tiny room of safety, never seeing the vast garden within. The smarter you are, the easier you are trapped by ego, because intelligence can rationalize fear. You call hesitation preparation, fear prudence. Meanwhile, truly strong people act first, trust later. For them, faith isn't a feeling that precedes action, it's what follows it. A student once asked Jung, "How do I know if I'm acting from self or from ego?" Jung replied, "If the act scares you but feels meaningful, it's self. If it feels safe but empty, it's ego. Ego fears the unknown. Self sees it as opportunity. Ego seeks validation. Self seeks truth. When you force yourself to believe, you're choosing self, even as ego screams. You say, "I know I'm scared, but I'm going anyway." In that moment, you create new evidence for your mind. I can trust myself. Faith isn't a static state, it's the reconciliation of inner opposites. You can't kill ego, you can only befriend it and keep it in the passenger seat. Without ego, you'd lack boundaries. With only ego, you'd lack soul. Real strength comes from their harmony, not from the absence of fear, but from knowing where fear belongs. Ask yourself, when I quit, is it truly because I no longer want it, or because my ego wants to keep me safe? If you pause and listen, that silence is the self, for the soul never shouts, it only whispers. When you force yourself to believe, you're not straining to be strong. You're shifting command from ego to self, from fear to trust, from "what if I fail?" to "what will I learn if I try?" Then you no longer need others to believe first. You no longer need the world's approval. Because now, belief itself becomes your reason. And that's when a person becomes unstoppable. Carl Jung wrote, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the opposites." Believing in yourself isn't denying fear, it's walking beside it. It's not eliminating ego, it's letting self drive. And each time you do, you move closer to the strongest version of yourself. Leave a comment with what you're facing, the fear, the voice, or the first step you're about to take. Every awakening begins with a confession, and sometimes sharing your story is already proof that you're on your way. And as you hear the self's voice more clearly, you'll realize another truth. Many voices in your head were never yours. They're echoes of the past, of family, of society, of those who once made you doubt. And that's when you must enter the next stage, breaking the spell of inherited voices. Number 3, breaking the spell of inherited voices. At some point in awakening, even after you've learned to tell ego from self, you still hear countless voices inside, not yours, yet speaking through you. They sound like parents, teachers, lovers, or society's ideals. They never shout, only whisper, just enough for you to believe them. You no longer need anyone to say you're not enough. You repeat it yourself. The scary part is, you don't even realize that voice isn't originally yours. Carl Jung called this the collective unconscious. He believed we don't just carry personal memory, but also inherited mental patterns, beliefs, and fears passed down through generations. Jung wrote, "The unconscious mind of man sees correctly even when conscious reason is blind and impotent." In other words, most of our self-concepts, what we can or can't do, aren't truly ours. They're programs imprinted from collective history, ancient survival scripts that once kept our ancestors alive, but now keep us small. Have you ever noticed that before doing something bold, a familiar voice arises, perhaps your mother's, "Don't be reckless," or your father's, "The world's not made for people like you"? Those aren't just personal memories. They're echoes from deeper layers, what Jung called archaic voices, the ancestral fear of rejection, exclusion, punishment. Once essential for survival, now they suffocate evolution. In a Jungian therapy case, a woman named Lydia grew up in a family that worshipped sacrifice as virtue. Her mother, strong but hardened, often said, "Don't think of yourself. Always give in." That phrase became Lydia's lifelong mantra. As an adult, whenever she tried to ask for a raise or leave a toxic relationship, guilt suffocated her. The thought, "You're selfish," became her inner voice. For years, she mistook it for morality, until she realized it was inheritance. One day, her therapist asked, "If your daughter lived exactly like you, always enduring, always afraid to upset others, would you be happy for her?" Lydia broke down in tears. She realized she was reliving her mother's suffering and calling it love. From that day, she began identifying every inner voice. When thoughts arose, "What will people think?" "Don't cause trouble," she asked. "Is this mine or someone else's?" Each time she asked, another spell dissolved. As Lydia detached from her mother's voice, subtle changes appeared. She stopped apologizing for saying no. She stopped pretending to agree just to be liked. At first, guilt haunted her. But one morning, looking in the mirror, she saw her eyes different, no longer afraid, no longer lowered. She no longer needed to force belief, because she had broken the strongest curse, the inherited one of smallness. When you see that many beliefs aren't yours, you stop living as a genetic replica of fear and start writing your soul's own story. In mythic language, this is like Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, symbol of consciousness and creation. For that act, he was chained to a mountain, his liver devoured daily by an eagle, yet he never regretted it. Prometheus represents the human soul, reclaiming its own fire, daring to awaken from obedience. Jung said each of us has a Prometheus imprisoned by ancestral voices, and only by reclaiming that fire, daring to believe despite conditioning, can the soul be freed. Your fear may not begin with you. It might be inherited from parents or grandparents who chose safety to survive. But that means, when you dare to believe, you're healing not just yourself, but them too. Jung believed the task of our generation is to break collective hypnosis, to let the soul live as itself, not as history's script. Because a person, he said, becomes truly free only when they can hear their own soul's voice, not the world's. But how do you know which voice is truly yours? Jung suggested a simple compass. Listen to the feeling behind it. The collective voice contracts you, heavy, fearful. The soul's voice, though still trembling, expands you, light, clear. When a thought arises, pause and ask, does this make me shrink or open? That's your most accurate spiritual compass. As you begin to live, you'll notice the armor society offers. Be humble, don't stand out, stay safe. But each armor that protects you also cages you. Forcing yourself to believe means daring to remove them layer by layer, trembling but alive, to feel your soul's true skin. There will be moments you'll feel like you're betraying someone, your parents, culture, or community, just for being authentic. But that's not betrayal. That's evolution. You're not rejecting your roots. You're refusing to remain buried in them. The soul cannot fly if it's still tied to the past by duty and fear. This process is slow, often painful, because to hear your soul, you must endure the silence after the old voices fade. Yet in that silence, something miraculous happens. A new voice emerges, soft but unmistakable. This is who I am. Jung called this the rebirth of the self. It doesn't happen through one grand awakening, but through small daily acts, telling the truth instead of pleasing, trying despite fear, believing before certainty. Carl Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." When you dare to choose, to believe, to act, you don't just change your life, you shift the energy of the lineage you came from. Thus, the journey to becoming unstoppable isn't about learning something new. It's about breaking spells, shedding inherited voices until only one remains: the whisper of your soul. It isn't loud, it's tender, saying, "You are enough. You are ready. You just need to remember." And when you hear it, you understand. Belief was never something to be forced. It was always yours, waiting for courage to reclaim it. Number 4, the shadow of self-doubt. Once you've broken free from inherited voices and realized how many beliefs weren't truly yours, another strange phenomenon appears. You think you're free, yet in the dark corners of your mind, something still holds you back. It's not your parents' voice, nor society's. It's older, deeper. The voice of the shadow, as Jung called it. The shadow isn't an enemy, but the other half of your soul, the vault of everything you've denied: weakness, anger, shame, doubt, and even your unexpressed greatness. Every time you say, "I can't," "I'm not good enough," it's not about the present. It's your shadow speaking, still trapped in old memories where you were judged and believed you were small. Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." Indeed, most doubt doesn't arise from weakness, but from never daring to face where fear began. We think if we avoid darkness, it will disappear. But what we forget is, darkness can't be erased, only illuminated. A friend of mine, a gifted creative woman, had impeccable taste, yet never shared her work publicly. When praised, she'd smile and say, "I'm not that good." In therapy, the counselor asked, "If someone else made the same thing, would you find it beautiful?" She nodded. He replied, "Then what you're rejecting isn't the work, it's yourself." That sentence made her cry, not from shame, but from revelation. She wasn't afraid of failure, she was afraid of success. Because if she truly shone, there'd be nowhere left to hide. Her shadow, taught to never be arrogant or too different, kept her small by making her doubt. After that, she revisited her old designs. She saw that what scared her wasn't imperfection, it was honesty. A week later, she released her first project. Not because fear vanished, but because she was tired of hiding. When praise came, she said, "I'm still nervous, but for the first time I feel free." That's the paradox Jung spoke of. People don't fear darkness, they fear their own light. They fear that when light reveals them, they'll have no excuse left to hide behind "not ready, not enough." Because light not only exposes talent, it exposes responsibility. Imagine your soul as a vast room, corners left unvisited, gathering dust. The more you fear, the tighter you lock the doors. Yet the darker it becomes, the more monstrous the unseen feels, until one day you dare to open them. Light pours in, and you find no monster at all, just a part of yourself, trembling, waiting to be embraced. And that is the true essence of forcing yourself to believe, not pretending you're fearless, but stepping into where you tremble, not with affirmations, but with courage. "I know I'm scared, and I'll go anyway." True faith isn't born from beautiful words, but from walking straight into what you used to avoid. Jung believed that each time we doubt ourselves, we're projecting an unintegrated part of the shadow. The shadow longs for acknowledgement. If you reject it, it manifests as procrastination, insecurity, envy. The more you try to stay positive, the stronger it gets. Only when you say, "I see you, you're scared, weak, and I still choose you," does it dissolve. Thus, forcing yourself to believe isn't suppressing fear, it's walking with it. It's not defeating the shadow, it's integrating it, so your strength is no longer split. The shadow isn't only fear of failure, it's fear of being seen, of responsibility, of no longer having a reason to stay small. It makes you shrink into a safe cage, and with every retreat, your soul loses a little vitality. Every time you avoid yourself, a part of you is left behind in the dark. Every time you face yourself, you bring that piece back to light. Jung called this process individuation, the journey to wholeness. Not becoming better, but becoming whole, where light and dark coexist. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain, because light can only illuminate when you let it shine on what scares you most. And in that moment, true faith, the kind that makes you unstoppable, is born." Remember, self-doubt isn't weakness. It's a fragment of the soul waiting to be healed. When you force yourself to believe, you're not suppressing fear, you're releasing trapped energy. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is like the submerged part of an iceberg. The visible tip, your confidence, roles, achievements, floats above. Beneath lie the rejected feelings, envy, fear, hurt. And it's the hidden part steering the visible. If unseen, it drives you unconsciously. To truly believe in yourself, you must dive, like a diver searching for pearls. Only by swimming through murky water can you glimpse the shimmering light below. And when you integrate the shadow, you no longer need to force belief, because it becomes natural. It doesn't come from logic, but from inner unity. You're no longer the person who both longs to move and fears the step. You become the one who sees fear, smiles, and says, "Let's go." That is the image of an unstoppable soul, still afraid, yet refusing to let fear steer, still doubting, yet walking on. In the end, forcing yourself to believe is the journey of befriending your shadow. For only by looking into your darkest corners will you discover your brightest light. And when that light rises, no past, no fear, no judgment can hold you back ever again. Number 5. Reprogramming the inner dialogue. Light, once it shines, doesn't just expose what you feared, it also leaves an open space where the soul must learn to speak to itself once again. And it is here that the journey of forcing yourself to believe and becoming unstoppable truly begins, by reprogramming your inner dialogue. Jung once said that all transformation begins with language, because thought is not merely an idea, it is living energy. Every sentence you whisper inside your head is a command sent to your unconscious. When you say, "I can't," the brain instantly contracts its energy and searches for evidence to support your fear. But when you say, "I am learning to do it," your brain activates regions of memory, creativity, and motivation. Language doesn't just describe reality, it creates reality. Carl Jung saw inner language as a ritual of transformation. He believed every sentence you choose to say is a spiritual act. Either you reinforce the prison of the unconscious, or you open the door to freedom. When you say, "I can," "I am doing," you are not deceiving yourself. You are retraining your brain to converse with your soul. And the very moment you force yourself to speak differently, you are beginning to force yourself to believe, not through willpower, but through the power of new awareness. Modern psychology calls this process neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire neural connections through language and experience. A negative sentence repeated many times becomes the default circuit of fear. A positive one, when repeated with real emotion, carves a new path. Forcing yourself to believe is therefore not merely a spiritual exercise, it is a biological act. You are reprogramming yourself. But to do this, you must first realize that most of what you think isn't really you thinking, it's old code running on autopilot. Like an outdated operating system, the mind keeps looping, "You're not enough. You'll fail." Those commands run automatically until you install a new version, a new belief. Jung once spoke of the river of the mind, always flowing, carrying whispers of the past, of others, and of yourself. You can't stop it, but you can choose what water to pour in. Every kind word is a drop of clean water. At first, it may seem to change nothing, but as you persist, the current becomes clear, and the old voices lose their power. I once heard the story of an artist named Eleanor, who stopped painting for 7 years because of one cruel remark. After a failed exhibition, her teacher's words, "You don't have real talent," kept echoing in her head like a verdict. Every time she picked up a brush, her hand trembled, her heart tightened, and she put everything away again. During therapy, Eleanor was guided to write down the sentences that frightened her and read them aloud with awareness. When she reached that particular sentence, she suddenly realized that the voice had never been hers. From that day on, each morning before work, she sat by the window, opened her old sketchbook, and drew a few lines. Not to be perfect, but to remind herself that her creative energy was still alive. 6 months later, she held her first exhibition again, in a quiet cafe. When asked how she found the courage to return, Eleanor simply said, "I started talking differently in my head." The centerpiece of her show was titled Rebirth, a living proof of forcing herself to believe and live again with her soul. That story shows that you don't have to believe completely at first. You just need to speak in the right direction, long enough for belief to take root. Many misunderstand inner dialogue as positive self-talk. Jung opposed that. He said language only has power when it is truthful to the soul. You don't need to say, "I'm not afraid," when you're trembling. Say instead, "I'm going, even though I'm afraid." That's real faith, honest and strong at once. Carl Rogers, who carried Jung's spirit forward, once said, "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change." In other words, forcing yourself to believe isn't denying weakness. It's looking straight at it and choosing to move anyway. When you say, "I am weak, but I am still worthy of love," you stop fighting yourself, and that's when healing truly begins. Jung believed humanity's greatest wound is that people never truly hear themselves. That's why he called speaking to oneself the sacred dialogue, the place where the soul is acknowledged. When you say, "I understand," or "I am learning to believe," you are mending the inner fragments. To force yourself to believe is, at its core, to change the storyteller inside your mind, from the voice of fear to the voice of the soul. If you stay silent, the unconscious will write the script. If you speak, the soul will hold the pen. When you are asleep, the voice in your head is the jailer. When you awaken, you become the listener. And when you choose your words consciously, you become the guide. A classic Jungian practice is to rewrite inner dialogue. When the mind says you can't, you write, I can, even if I don't yet know how. Repeat this daily, and your unconscious will respond differently. The negative voice stops being the truth and becomes just an opinion. Once you stop treating it as reality, it loses its energy. Here, the self begins to reclaim space. The ego, with its habit of judgment, is softened by kind language. Jung said, "You don't break ice with a hammer, but with steady warmth." Gentle words to yourself are that warmth. To force yourself to believe isn't to shout, "I am strong," but to whisper, "I'm learning to be strong." It's not conquering your mind overnight, but rewriting one sentence at a time until the voice inside changes tone. Then belief is no longer an effort, it becomes instinct. Human life doesn't change through grand events, but through the quiet sentences repeated every day. In moments of disappointment, what you say to yourself is where the soul gets reprogrammed. I once knew a woman who had tried everything to heal: meditation, therapy, books, yet still felt something missing. She understood so much, yet deep inside, there was an emptiness she couldn't fill. One day, when asked what she told herself every morning, she fell silent. In that silence, the answer appeared. All this time, she had never truly spoken with her soul. She had let fear, doubt, and old voices speak for her. Inner language is a muscle. If you don't train it, old reflexes return. So instead of trying to defeat doubt, just repeat a simple sentence. I am learning to believe. That small phrase holds immense healing power. It acknowledges fear while opening the door for faith. Today, write down 3 sentences you want your mind to believe. Read them every morning, not to convince yourself, but to remember. One day, when your mouth says, I can, without hesitation, that's when the old program has been replaced. Forcing yourself to believe isn't forcing yourself into illusion. It's reclaiming the stolen language of your original faith. When you learn to speak again in your true voice, you don't just heal, you reclaim authorship of your destiny. Carl Jung once wrote, "Words are animals alive. They feed on our soul. If you feed them with fear, they become monsters. If you feed them with faith, they become wings." Each time you choose to speak differently, you are choosing your own wings. Speak, even if you don't fully believe yet, because one day, when you look back, you'll realize it was those quiet words you whispered in solitude that wrote the final chapter of this journey, where you stand tall, free, and no longer need to force belief. Because by then, you are the living proof of faith itself. If this video has touched a part of you, the part that longs to believe again, to rewrite the conversation in your mind, hit like to let me know you're still here, still walking this path. Because one small click isn't just support for the channel, it's a commitment to your soul, that you will no longer let the old voice lead. Number 6. Action, the ritual of faith. Faith does not precede action. Action gives birth to faith. You can spend hours affirming, I believe in myself, but if you don't stand up, write the first page, send the first email, step outside your familiar room, your brain will never have a reason to believe. Carl Jung once said, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And likewise, Real faith doesn't come from imagining strength, it comes from acting in the dark. Because in psychology, faith isn't an idea, it's the body's memory. You cannot convince yourself it'll be fine until you do the thing you fear and survive it. Jung called every courageous act an experiment of the self. Each time you do what scares you, not because you already believe, but because you want to learn to believe, you're performing a sacred ritual. That act tells your unconscious, I choose to move, even though the fearful part of me hasn't vanished. That is forcing yourself to believe through experience. True faith doesn't arise in the mind, it's born in every cell when the body realizes, I did it. Every time you act differently, you create new evidence, and that evidence is stronger than any affirmation. In the Bible, there's a story that deeply impressed Jung, the story of Abraham. When God asked him to leave his homeland, to abandon everything for an unknown land, Abraham didn't yet know where he was going. He only knew he must go. That first step in darkness, without a map, without guarantees, became the foundation of the Abrahamic faiths, the root of 3 great religions. Jung saw Abraham as the symbol of a soul daring to leave the homeland of the collective unconscious to begin the individuation journey, the return to the true self. Abraham didn't wait until he was sure God would protect him. He acted first, and faith followed. And that's what you must remember. You don't need to be fearless to begin. You only need to begin so that fear knows it no longer commands you. For Jung, action is not just physical movement, it's a spiritual ritual, a ritual of becoming. Every morning you wake up and do something small but aligned with your soul. It's not just a habit, it's a silent prayer of faith. Faith is not born in moments when you feel ready, but in the days when you have nothing left but fatigue, yet you still refuse to turn back. It's in those seemingly meaningless steps that you weave the invisible strength that makes you unstoppable. Jung wrote, "Even a happy life cannot be without a measure of darkness, and the word happy would lose its meaning if it were not balanced by sadness." True faith, therefore, isn't a bright feeling. It's quiet perseverance through the dim phases of the journey. It's the ability to keep walking when there's no light, when no one sees you, when even you aren't sure where you're heading. Think of the people you admire. None of them waited to feel confident before starting. They just did what had to be done, day after day, until repetition became identity. Every act is a small prayer, turning abstraction into reality. Modern psychology confirms what Jung intuited decades ago. Repeated behavior reshapes self-identity. When you act as a confident person, even before you feel it, the brain begins to record you as one. If you want to believe you're disciplined, wake up 5 minutes earlier each day without hitting snooze. If you want to believe you can speak up, start by sharing one small idea in a meeting. Every small action is a vote for the version of yourself you're becoming. No need for big change, only conscious repetition, and belief will form as a biological reflex. In Jungian thought, the self doesn't exist as an idea. It must incarnate through action. If the soul is a flame, action is the lamp that makes the light visible. Without action, the soul is trapped in theory. Jung once said, "One of modern humanity's great mistakes is that we think too much and live too little. We understand confidence, healing, faith, but we rarely take the step that embodies them. Thus, knowledge never turns into transformation, and the soul remains stuck in concepts. A runner training every morning isn't just strengthening muscles, they're teaching the mind, I'm worth caring for. A person journaling at night isn't just recording events, they're proving to themselves, I'm worth listening to. Someone stepping on stage isn't just speaking publicly, they're telling their soul, I trust my voice. That is prayer through action, the living expression of what Jung called active imagination in the outer world. Faith becomes strongest when it no longer resides in your head, but flows through your body, your voice, your daily gestures. Even the smallest action today, standing tall, writing one line saying I'll try, sends a signal to your unconscious. A new era has begun. The unconscious doesn't understand logic, it understands movement. If you say I want to change but do nothing, it thinks you're dreaming. But if you take one trembling step, it understands. This person is in motion. Then it mobilizes all hidden energy to support you. That's how action turns you into an unstoppable force. Eventually, you reach a stage where you no longer act to prove you can. You act because it's who you are. Like trees don't try to grow, or the sun doesn't try to shine. You act not because you need faith, but because you are faith. There's no line between I'm trying to believe and I am belief itself. You become your own flow, silent, yet unstoppable. True faith isn't certainty, it's commitment to act in the dark. You don't need to see the whole path. You just need to take one step, and the path unfolds. Carl Jung once wrote, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." Remember, every time you act differently, no matter how small, you sign a new covenant with your soul. Each step, each honest word, each choice to move forward instead of shrink back is a sacred ritual of faith. That's how you not only force yourself to believe, but turn belief into lived reality. And one day, you'll realize you no longer need to believe you're unstoppable, because you've become it. Faith is not something you have, it is something you become. Number 7. The story of Sophia, when faith is forged in the dark night. After everything, perhaps the hardest part isn't understanding faith, but living it. Everyone has heard advice like, believe in yourself. But in the silent hours of the night, when no one is watching, those words lose their power. In that moment, you don't need philosophy. You need a living example, a soul who has walked through darkness, fallen, trembled, and still chosen to move forward. Because sometimes, the story of a real human being is the clearest mirror for the soul. Among countless such stories, there is one woman I'll never forget, Sophia. She wasn't a saint or a perfect model, just an ordinary person like you. But in her darkness, she learned the deepest truth about faith. That faith is not a feeling, but a habit forged in the fire of doubt. Sophia was what Jung would call the divided soul, torn between who she knew she could become and who she had been taught to be. By day, she appeared confident, composed, polite, always saying thank you at the right time. But at night, sitting alone before the mirror, she stared into her tired eyes and asked, "Why, after doing everything right, do I still feel not enough?" She had everything the world called a good life, a stable job, respected friends, a neat existence. But deep inside, there was an emptiness that nothing could fill. In that space echoed an old voice, her father's. "You should be realistic. Don't dream too much. Don't think you're special." Each time Sophia had a new dream, She strangled it before it could breathe, convincing herself this was maturity. Then she realized the voice of doubt wasn't just her father's, it was the unlived life of her father continuing through her. He had given up his artistic dream for stability, and through his warnings, passed that fear down to his daughter. The family's collective unconscious had programmed her, don't dream too big, don't go too far. But one night, after a devastating failure at work, every mask she had ever worn fell away. Sitting silently in the dark, with nothing left to lose, she turned on the radio and heard a line from Jung. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. That sentence shone like a torch into the center of her soul. Sophia realized that the light she'd been seeking wasn't in success or recognition. It was in her willingness to sit with her own darkness, to listen to the voice that had ruled her for years, and to stop obeying it. The next morning, she did something small yet revolutionary. She applied for a position she once thought she wasn't good enough for. Her hands trembled, her heart raced, her mind screamed objections. But she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered, I will act, even if faith hasn't arrived yet. That was the moment she forced herself to believe, not through words, but through movement. When she hit send on that email, a strange stillness spread through her body. Not because she was sure she would succeed, but because, for the first time, she felt she was on her own side. A month later, she got the job. But the real victory wasn't the outcome. It was the realization that she didn't need the world to believe in her first. The moment she believed, the world began to move in response. By acting, Sophia didn't know what awaited her, but she knew that if she waited for certainty, she would remain trapped in the suffocating safety of the old. That one small act, stepping into darkness, opened the door to a new life. From that day, she lived differently. Each morning, instead of striving for perfection, she chose one small act that made her heart feel alive. Sketching a few messy lines, writing a few words of gratitude, or simply sitting by the window, watching the morning light. She called them rituals of faith, simple gestures to remind her soul it was still alive. No grand plans, no distant goals, just honesty with her inner rhythm. Gradually she realized what she truly longed for was not love or recognition, but to return to herself, the girl who once dreamed, desired, and believed in the invisible. And to return there, she had to learn faith again, not through intellect, but through small steps taken in darkness, unseen, unpraised. Her inner world began to change. The things that once terrified her, silence, loneliness, failure, became allies. She understood that true faith isn't forged in brightness, but in shadow. She no longer tried to be positive, nor to appear strong. Instead, she sat still, listened to her heartbeat, and whispered, I'm still here. I'm still moving. Jung believed that every authentic act is a ritual of the soul, a ritual of becoming. And Sophia's actions, though small, were exactly that. When she dared to send that email, to apply, to say, I want, she wasn't just acting, she was retraining her unconscious that fear was no longer in control. Each act became a kind of alchemy of faith. A year later, Sophia was no longer the same person, not because she achieved something grand, but because her way of being had changed. She no longer waited for inspiration to act. Action itself became inspiration. She no longer waited for faith to come. She lived as if she already had it. Faith was no longer something she held on to. It was something she exhaled each day. One afternoon, while teaching her first class in the new job, Sophia looked at the young faces before her. For a second, she saw an image, a 10-year-old girl sitting alone, drawing in her small room, tearing up her picture out of fear of criticism. Sophia smiled. That painting now lived again, not on paper, but in her life itself. The deepest change in Sophia wasn't success, but peace. She no longer fought to prove anything. She lived, acted, loved, and rested with the sense that everything was happening as it should. Faith, to her now, wasn't a blazing fire that made her excited, but a quiet ember, warm, steady, eternal. Sophia's story isn't one of triumph, but of awakening. When you dare to do the smallest thing your light longs for, even as darkness surrounds you, you are forging faith in the night. Light doesn't need to eliminate darkness. It only needs to live within it. When Sophia looked back, she realized the moment that truly changed her life wasn't when she succeeded, but when she said, "I will act, even if faith hasn't arrived yet." That sentence opened an entirely new life, one where action became prayer and faith became breath. Now, when others ask her for the secret to confidence, she simply says, "Don't wait to feel belief. Do what your soul knows is right, and faith will follow." Sophia no longer talks about faith, she lives it. And in the soft morning light, when she looks into the mirror, she no longer sees a divided soul. She sees someone whole, where shadow and light are no longer separate, someone who no longer needs to force herself to believe, because she is faith. Number 8. The mirror ritual, meeting the self. Perhaps in that moment when Sophia looked into the mirror and smiled, she did something most people only read about but rarely experience. She met her true self. Because in the end, every awakening leads to the same place, where your gaze and your soul meet in silence. In Jungian psychology, the mirror is not just a reflective object, but a symbol of the meeting point between the conscious and the unconscious. It's where two worlds intersect, the part of you that you know, and the part you've forgotten. Each time you look into a mirror, you're not just seeing your face, you're facing millions of memories, roles, and beliefs that shaped that image. Yet most of us glance quickly, fix our hair, and walk away, leaving the soul still waiting to be seen. Imagine your soul as an ocean, and your consciousness as the thin layer of waves above it. Each day you're caught in work, relationships, goals, praise and criticism, forgetting the still, deep water beneath. The mirror is the window into that depth. When you dare to look longer, quieter, deeper, the water begins to clear, and you see not a face, but a soul. There's an ancient Jungian therapeutic practice called the mirror ritual. Participants are guided to stand before a mirror every morning, look directly into their own eyes for 3 minutes in silence. No words, no performance, no avoidance. At first, most feel awkward. Some cry, some feel fear or emptiness. But one day, unexpectedly, they stop seeing a face and see a soul looking back. One woman shared that on the 5th morning. She whispered, "I can see my 13-year-old eyes again." The room fell silent. That was the moment she met the part of herself she had lost. But this ritual is more than a psychological exercise. It's a sacred encounter. The mirror is the most honest teacher. It never lies. It doesn't care whether you're pretending to be strong or broken, happy or weary. It reflects exactly the energy you bring. If you look with avoidance, it mirrors separation. If you look with courage, it mirrors wholeness. Think about how often you look in the mirror not to see yourself, but to fix yourself, to correct flaws, emotions, appearances. We've turned mirrors into instruments of judgment instead of doors to awareness. But the mirror wasn't created for you to look right. It was created for you to be present. Carl Jung once said, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. When you look into the mirror, you're not seeing with your eyes, you're seeing with your heart." That gaze doesn't seek perfection. It seeks truth. The mirror, in Jungian terms, is the meeting point between persona and self. The persona is the mask, the role, title and image you show the world. The self is the deepest core, your true soul. Each morning, when you face the mirror, the persona is the one looking, and the self is the one looking back. Two worlds meet in that instant. The mirror ritual teaches those two estranged beings to speak again. That's why this practice is never mere affirmation. It's a dialogue between soul and body. When you say, "I am becoming myself," you're not declaring a lie. You're sending a signal to your unconscious. I have returned. A student once told me she felt unable to say that sentence at first. I can't say I am becoming myself because I don't yet know who I am. I smiled and said, "That's exactly why you need to say it. Because this ritual doesn't require belief, it creates belief. Like a seed doesn't need to understand the sun to sprout. Your soul doesn't need certainty to begin remembering itself." In fact, every ancient culture had its own mirror ritual. The Greeks gazed into water to divine the future. The Egyptians saw mirrors as gateways to the afterlife. The Japanese called the act mikagami, to look into God. They all understood that between the mirror and the soul lies an invisible thread. It's no coincidence that in many myths, demons cast no reflection, because only those with a living soul can be mirrored. A woman named Clara once told me she began this practice during a deep depression. Each morning, she stood before the mirror, unable to speak. One day, she saw her own sunken, sleepless eyes and suddenly cried, not out of hate, but compassion. She realized that after thousands of glances over the years, she had never truly seen them. From that morning on, she began whispering, "I'm still here." Those 3 words became a bridge between her and her soul. 6 months later, Clara returned to work, began writing again, painting again, loving again. When I asked what had changed, she said, "Because for the first time, I looked at myself and didn't turn away." That is the power of the mirror ritual. It doesn't change the world, but it changes the one living in it. And when that person changes, the world follows. Jung believed that all true healing begins with seeing. No fixing, no erasing, just seeing. Because light doesn't need to fight darkness, it only needs to be turned on. When you can look into your own eyes without avoidance, judgment, or the urge to look better, it means you've reached harmony. For the one who no longer fears themselves has already transcended the world. From there, every action you take, brewing tea, replying to an email, saying thank you, carries a different energy, the energy of presence. You no longer act to prove, but to express. You no longer act to be believed in, but because you are belief. If you begin this practice, remember, don't seek a special feeling. Don't wait for lightning enlightenment. Just stand there each morning in soft light and look into your eyes as you would at an old friend. Today you may see only fatigue. Tomorrow, maybe sadness. But one day, without warning, you'll see something different. A thin beam of light, a quiet peace spreading in your chest. That's your soul smiling, welcoming you home. Because ultimately, the journey of forcing yourself to believe isn't about running from darkness. It's about standing still in your own gaze. When you can look without hiding, without acting, you've crossed the final threshold, the threshold of self-awareness. In that light, you'll understand what every philosopher, analyst, and awakened soul has tried to say. Faith doesn't come from thinking you can. It comes from knowing who you are. And when you know that, all limits dissolve. You no longer need to say, "I will do it," because you've become the one who does. You no longer say, "I believe," because faith has merged with your breath. Each morning, when you face the mirror, let this ritual become the bridge between the old day and the new one, between who you were and who you're becoming. Look, just look, and whisper, "I am becoming myself." Because in that moment, you are no longer the one learning to believe. You are faith, alive. So we've now traveled 2/3 of the journey through force yourself to believe in yourself and become unstoppable. If you're still here, it means you've been brave enough to look inward, to not only understand, but experience yourself. Before continuing, pause for a moment. Breathe deeply, slowly. And if you can, look into the mirror once more. Not to adjust, but to recognize the one looking back. The soul unmasked. If something in this part has touched you, if you've ever experienced a moment where you saw yourself differently, even just for a heartbeat, leave one word in the comments. Faith. Just one word, but it may be the first step to restoring the language between your soul and yourself. And who knows, someone may read your word, gather courage, stand before the mirror, smile, and whisper, "I believe in myself." Number 9. The courage to remove the mask. When you have the courage to look into your own eyes and see your soul smiling back, a truth appears that what has stopped you from living authentically has never been a lack of faith, but the masks you still wear. After all the journey, there remains one final layer that people fear removing, even more than darkness itself: the persona, the social mask. It was born to be loved, to be accepted, to survive among the collective. But if it lives too long, it makes us forget the true face of the soul. Carl Jung called the persona the performing self, the part of us we use to live in the world, to be named, to stay safe. Since childhood, we had learned how to wear it. The obedient child is praised, the strong child is loved, the agreeable person is accepted, the excellent one is respected. And slowly, we build around ourselves a shell so perfect that even we begin to believe that it is who we are. Until one day, we realize that something doesn't fit, as if the soul is struggling to breathe beneath the mask it once thought would save it. To live under the persona is to live like an actor in your own life. You say what is expected, smile at the right time, work hard, and are praised as stable, successful. Yet every night when the lights go out, you feel empty. Not because you are not enough, but because you are no longer yourself. Jung believed that the price of the persona is inner division. You can please the whole world, but your soul will remain lonely. I once heard a woman say during a therapy session, "I'm afraid that if I live authentically, I'll lose everything." The therapist asked, "Are you sure what you have is really yours, or are they just rewards for the role you've been playing?" That question left her silent for a long time. Because what's frightening is not loss, it's realizing that everything you've been holding was never real. Removing the mask is the bravest act because it doesn't bring happiness right away. On the contrary, it often begins with confusion. When you stop performing, you won't know what to say, who you are. That emptiness makes many people return to the persona, because at least there, they know what to do to be loved. But if you can stay patient in that silence, you'll begin to hear a small but genuine calling, the voice of the soul. Because when you remove the mask, you don't just reclaim your true face, you reclaim your soul. Think of Audrey Hepburn, the icon of elegance in the 20th century. The world knew her for her perfect roles, gentle smile, flawless grace. But behind the lights, she had been deeply wounded by war, had starved, had seen destruction. In her diary, she wrote that true elegance doesn't come from appearance, but from the ability to keep the heart intact after it has broken. When she left Hollywood, she chose to devote the rest of her life to UNICEF, visiting the poorest regions, holding starving children in her arms. When asked, "Aren't you afraid of losing your image?" she simply smiled. "I no longer need to keep an image. I just need to live truthfully." That image proves what Jung meant. When you dare to remove the mask, you don't lose your magnetism. You become so real that no one can forget you. The persona makes you loved for the role you play, but only the true self allows others to touch your soul. The modern world praises confidence, but most confidence is only a well-trained persona, confidence born of control, not honesty. Someone can speak fluently, smile brightly, dominate a room, yet still tremble inside. The person who truly believes in themselves is quieter. They don't need to prove anything. They don't say, "Look at me." They simply exist, and others feel the energy of truth. I once heard the story of a music teacher. She had taught for 20 years but never performed. When her students asked why, she said, "Because I'm afraid I'm not good enough." One day, after a major event, she decided to sing at the year-end ceremony. Her voice trembled, her hands were sweaty, her first note was off-key, but she didn't stop. When the song ended, the entire hall stood up and applauded, not because her voice was perfect, but because they heard something real. Afterward, she said, "Today, I sang not for others to love me, but so that I could stop hating myself." To force yourself to believe at this stage means daring to live truthfully, because pretense and real confidence cannot coexist. When you perform, you must control, but true faith only grows in surrender. When you dare to say, "I don't know," "I'm scared," "I'm learning," you open the door for the soul to return. Because the self, the true being, only appears when the persona is lowered. But removing the mask doesn't mean giving up social roles. Jung never advised people to withdraw from the world. He only warned that if you completely identify with your role, you will lose your soul. In other words, you don't need to destroy the persona, you only need to know when it's speaking for you. When you can choose when to wear it and when to take it off, you've mastered it. Removing the mask is not a one-time act, but a lifelong process. Every day you will discover subtler layers, the mask of the healer, the wise one, the one who has overcome. Each time you recognize and smile at it, another layer of true light is revealed. One day, try something small. Tell the truth in a conversation you would normally avoid. Say, "I'm tired. I'm afraid. I'm not sure." At first, you'll tremble because the ego fears losing its image. But when the words leave your mouth, you'll feel a light flow through your chest. That's your soul breathing. People think courage means facing the world, but real courage is facing yourself when there's no role left to hide behind. At that moment, there's nowhere to run. Only the bare soul remains. And in that nakedness, you find strength. And this is the crucial stage of the journey of forcing yourself to believe, not believing in an image, but in your essence. When you live truthfully, you no longer need to believe you are enough. You know you are. You don't need to impress, because your presence itself is impression. You don't need to be loved, because you already are love. Then, everything you do, the way you speak, walk, look at others, becomes a prayer for truth. There is no longer a split between the person I appear to be and the person I am. You become one continuous flow, and from that unity, real power radiates. If you want to force yourself to believe, begin here. Dare to remove the mask. Dare to let your true self be seen, even if it's imperfect. Dare to live, feel, and smile with the parts you once hid. And in that moment, you'll understand. You don't need to believe in the image you've created, because your true soul is the only thing that will never betray you. When the persona dissolves, faith is no longer something to practice, it becomes breath. You don't need to say, "I believe in myself," because you have returned to being yourself. And when that happens, you'll realize all the previous steps, from overcoming doubt, facing the shadow, to the mirror ritual, were only leading you here, to the place where the soul stops acting, where you can stand in the world, smile, and whisper, "I just need to be." Because in the end, there is no faith stronger than that of someone who dares to live truthfully, and there is no power greater than a soul no longer afraid of its own light. Number 10. Mental hygiene, protecting the temple of the mind. When you have been brave enough to remove your mask and return to your true self, the journey doesn't end, it has only just begun. Because living authentically is not a single moment, but an ongoing act of preservation. Like a candle newly lit in the wind, the awakened soul still needs a place to dwell, a sanctuary where faith won't be extinguished by the toxicity of the outside world. Carl Jung called this psychic hygiene, mental hygiene. He believed that just as the body needs to be cleansed daily, the mind also needs purification from invisible dirt, toxic news, judgment, anxiety, envy, meaningless conversations. No one can maintain faith while living amid noise. A polluted mind, no matter how radiant the soul, will dim its light. Keeping mental hygiene doesn't mean withdrawing from the world. It means knowing what is allowed to remain in your mind. Like a temple guardian watching over the sacred gates, you must stay awake enough to discern what nourishes and what harms. Every thought, every image, every conversation is a guest entering that temple. Some bring flowers, others come with mud on their feet. If you are not vigilant, the mud will spread, and soon you'll forget that the temple once smelled of blossoms. Imagine your mind as a clear lake. Each thought is a stone thrown into its surface. Negative news, judgments, comparisons, fears, all create ripples that cloud the water. If you never stop, soon you can no longer see the bottom, your own soul. But if, each day, you let the lake rest, the surface clears again. When the mind is still, the soul reflects clearly. That is the foundation of faith, clarity before certainty. Jung once wrote, "Faith cannot be born in a polluted environment." He realized that people who think they have lost faith are merely surrounded by too many voices. When they learn to step away from the noise, even for a few minutes, they begin to hear the voice of the self again. And when the self speaks, faith doesn't need to be trained, it rises naturally. A viewer once wrote to the channel to share her story. She was a creative director at a major company, successful, admired, but exhausted. Every morning, she read the news, checked social media, answered emails, listened to podcasts, all at once. She said she was afraid of missing something, but the more she tried to keep up, the emptier she felt. When asked when she last sat in silence, she couldn't answer. She was the image of the modern woman, knowing everything about the world, but nothing about her own soul. In therapy, she was asked to fast from information for 3 days. No phone, no news, only the forest and a blank notebook. On the first day, she nearly went mad. She wrote, "I can't stand the silence. It feels like being cut off from the world." But by the third day, she wrote, "For years, I haven't been living. I've only been reacting." In that moment, she understood. When the mind is cleansed of noise, the soul begins to speak. From then on, she began a new ritual, 10 minutes of silence each morning. No phone, no plan, just sitting quietly, watching the first light touch the wall. She called it her mental hygiene. 6 months later, she said, "I no longer see life as a race, but as a river. I don't need to swim. I just need not to stir the water. You don't need to try to be stronger, only clearer." Faith doesn't come from adding more, but from subtracting. When you remove noise, comparison, judgment, chaotic energy, your true self naturally returns to the center. In other words, the quieter the mind, the stronger the faith. If you live in a toxic environment, the brain merely reacts for survival. But when the mind is clean, the self returns to command, and every action flows from awareness instead of fear. The modern world makes it harder than ever to keep the mind clean. We are surrounded by noise, emails, social media, advice, expectations. Every time you open your phone, you open the doors of your temple to hundreds of strangers. They tell you who to be, how to live, what to believe. Without mental boundaries, they take the place of your soul. You begin to live to the rhythm of the world instead of your own. That's why Jung emphasized conscious solitude. He said, "Solitude is the furnace of transformation." Silence isn't an escape, it's the fire that refines the soul, like gold in the crucible. When you dare to step away from the crowd, you don't lose connection. You reconnect with your true center. Imagine you live in a temple where the soul is the deity and the mind is the wall. Every word you speak, every book you read, every person you allow in paints on that wall. If you don't choose carefully, chaotic drawings will soon cover the sacred figure within. But if you learn to wipe clean, to keep the wall pure, you'll see the face of the deity again, your own soul. And once you see that, faith becomes as natural as breathing. Mental hygiene is not a luxury, it's the soul's survival need. Each morning, when you choose not to check your phone for the first 30 minutes, you are honoring your temple. When you avoid negative talk, you are closing the door to dark energy. When you sit quietly for 5 minutes to breathe, you are dusting the altar of your mind. They're small acts, but they carry the essence of ritual. Jung believed that every conscious repetition is a ritual of the soul. When you maintain that inner purity, your soul stays, and faith no longer needs to be forced. It's born naturally from inner stillness. Try this. Each night before sleeping, instead of scrolling your phone, ask your mind 3 questions. What did I let into my mind today? Among them, what nourished me and what harmed me? What do I want to invite into my temple tomorrow? These 3 small questions are the broom of the temple keeper. They help you clean before you sleep. And the next morning, you'll wake up lighter, clearer. Not because the world changed, but because you changed how you live within it. Each morning, before stepping into the world, imagine you are entering a sacred temple, your mind. Pause at the door, take a deep breath and ask, what energy do I want my mind to carry today? That question is like lighting an invisible incense stick, a prayer for awareness. Forcing yourself to believe is not a battle against fear. It's the practice of keeping your mind clean enough for the soul to stay. And when the soul stays, nothing, no noise, no judgment, no chaos can stop you. Number 11. Visualization, the door between conscious and unconscious. Have you ever noticed that when the mind becomes still, what follows is not emptiness, but an invitation? A quiet door opens, leading you into the realm of visualization. This is not a skill of daydreaming, but the act of seeing through the soul before the world has a chance to prove it. If faith is the dew on a leaf, then visualization is the sunlight that makes it shine. Without sunlight, the dew fades into oblivion, but when light touches it, it reflects the entire sky. Faith already exists, but it remains silent and unseen until imagination illuminates it, making the invisible visible. Carl Jung believed imagination was the original language of the unconscious. When consciousness speaks through logic, the unconscious replies through images. Every dream, intuition, or moment when you see a scene in your mind before it happens, that is how the unconscious communicates with you. And if you learn to listen, to visualize with intention, you open a dialogue between 2 worlds, consciousness and the unconscious, the known and the yet to be born. Imagine your mind as an old cinema. Each morning, you decide which film will play that day. Will it be scenes of fear and anxiety, or of strength and trust? Most people let the world choose for them. They turn on the news, read comments, hear others' opinions, and those images project onto the inner screen, becoming the script they unconsciously live by. But those who dare to force themselves to believe do differently. They turn off the noise, clean the screen, and play the film their soul wants to live. Science has confirmed what Jung once said. In an experiment at the University of Colorado, Dr. Richard Suin divided athletes into 2 groups. One trained physically, the other only in their minds. The result? The group that trained through visualization still gained over 80% of the strength of those who trained physically. The brain cannot distinguish between what you do and what you vividly imagine. It only reacts to experience. When you imagine with full emotion, the brain sends signals that activate the same neural and hormonal systems as if it were really happening. That's why those who visualize can rebuild faith faster than anyone, Because they're not just thinking, they're retraining their entire body to believe. But visualization is not fantasy. Fantasy is escape, while visualization is preparation. The dreamer says, "I wish," while the visualizer says, "It's coming." One demands from fear, the other creates from presence. And that is the line between forcing belief and becoming belief. When you merely repeat affirmations, consciousness is fighting the unconscious. But when you visualize, you stop forcing. You invite the unconscious to co-create. You're no longer alone on your journey to becoming unstoppable. Your soul walks beside you. I once met a painter who said she never began painting until she had already seen the picture in her mind. Sometimes, she said, I don't paint the picture paints through me. That is active imagination, the very technique Jung used in therapy. He taught patients not only to analyze their mental images, but to converse with them. When you imagine meeting the wounded part of yourself and listening to it, it's not random fantasy. It's how you bring the unconscious into light. And once the unconscious is seen, it no longer controls you. Science calls this transformation neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself. Every time you visualize yourself strong, calm, brave, you are building neural pathways that match that version of you. You are teaching your brain, this is me. And if repeated long enough, your body begins to believe. Faith stops being a slogan. It becomes a biological reflex. When you visualize, you're not trying to change reality. You're shifting your own frequency so that reality can reflect it. Like tuning a radio, you don't force the station to change. You adjust your own dial until you hear the song you desire. Each time you visualize, you are tuning the frequency of your soul, and the outer world begins to resonate. That's how the unconscious and reality meet, not through pressure, but through harmony. But visualization only gains power when infused with emotion. The unconscious doesn't understand language, it understands energy. If you visualize with fear, it hears fear. If you visualize with gratitude, it hears faith. Images become real only when warmed by feeling. And this is where forcing yourself to believe transforms into allowing yourself to feel. When you feel yourself as the one who already believes, the unconscious believes with you. So what should you visualize? Not what you want to have, but who you want to become. Don't focus on outcomes. Visualize essence, the calm gaze, steady breath, the way you walk when you are no longer afraid. Because the universe doesn't respond to desire. It responds to the energy of the one emitting it. When you become that person in your mind, the world begins to mirror it outside. A viewer once asked me, if I don't yet believe, how can I visualize? I said, visualize the person learning to believe. That is the first step of every unstoppable journey, not to believe fully, but to believe that belief can be built. Hold that image long enough, and the unconscious will complete the rest. Each morning, in silence, imagine this. There is a version of you standing on the other side of fear, smiling at you. She isn't perfect, but she is whole. Let her light reach you, gentle yet steady. Don't try to see clearly, just feel. As you breathe deeply, that breath carries faith back into every cell. This is not delusion, it is the ritual of one becoming unstoppable. In the end, visualization is not a tool for achieving, but a ritual for becoming. When you visualize with a clean mind, you're not creating something new, you're wiping the dust off what already exists. Like an artist cleaning an old painting, you're revealing the image of your soul. And in that moment you realize, all great things begin as an image, a small spark in the mind of someone who dared to believe it could be real. So if you're in the middle of the journey of forcing yourself to believe, don't strain your willpower further. Close your eyes and see yourself, not as who you're trying to become, but as who you already are. Let visualization become the bridge between the present and your soul, between fear and faith. Because deep within the unconscious, the image you hold each day is not imagination. It's a promise to your future. When reality begins to reflect what you once only dared to imagine, you'll understand. You never truly forced yourself to believe. You simply taught your mind to see through the eyes of your soul. And when that happens, you no longer need to strive to be unstoppable, because you, at that moment, have already become the force that nothing can stop. Number 12. Adriana's story, when visualization becomes the soul's prophecy. When we begin to visualize through the soul, the images that appear are not merely products of imagination. They are the language of the unconscious, fragments of memories that were never fully lived. Sometimes these images do not come from dreams, but from the people we meet, from loves that seem accidental, yet were written long ago in the depths of the soul. Because there are encounters not meant for love, but for remembrance. There are people who do not come to stay, but to awaken the part of our soul we have forgotten. And no one illustrates this truth more clearly than Adriana, a woman who learned that love is not always the destination, but the mirror that helps us see our true self. Adriana once believed she understood love. She had loved, parted, learned her lessons, and believed her heart was mature enough not to dream anymore. But through all her relationships, one feeling lingered, as though she was searching for someone her soul had known for a very long time. One evening in March, after a long day, Adriana sat alone in her small apartment in Lisbon, watching the sea through the window. The wind carried a soft, salty sound. She opened her journal and wrote, "What if the person I've been searching for is the part of my soul I once abandoned?" Closing the notebook, she shut her eyes. An image arose, a man standing on the sand, his back to her, the sunset resting on his shoulders. He said nothing. She didn't know who he was, only that her heart suddenly softened, as if recognizing something ancient. From that day on, Adriana began visualizing that scene each morning. At first, it was just for relaxation, but gradually it became a ritual. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw more clearly his posture, his clothes, even his breath. She didn't try to imagine him. The image came by itself, as if the soul were retelling a forgotten story. 3 weeks later, while on a business trip to Florence, Adriana sat in a small cafe. A man walked in and sat across from her. He smiled, and in that moment, she almost forgot to breathe. The grey coat, the calm gaze, it was exactly the image she had seen in her morning meditations. She smiled softly, thinking it was a coincidence. But as they talked, she felt something beyond language. His voice, gestures, eyes, all strangely familiar. His name was Marco, a sculptor preparing for an exhibition. And from that moment, a story began, with no plan, no promise, only two souls moving in the same rhythm. She didn't fall for his words, but for the way he listened. Around him, she didn't need to appear intelligent or strong. Their silence wasn't heavy, it was warm, like an ancient language returning. One afternoon by the Arno River, Marco asked, "Do you ever believe souls can recognize each other?" Adriana looked at the shimmering water and whispered, "I don't just believe. I think it's happening. But love, like every mirror, reflects both light and shadow." After days of happiness, small cracks began to appear. Marco tended to withdraw into silence when hurt, while Adriana reacted with fear. Each time he grew distant, she felt lost, as if a part of her existence were slipping away. One night, in a mixture of anger and confusion, Marco said only one sentence. "You're not really listening to me. You're listening to your own fear." That sentence silenced her. She realized he was right. She wasn't loving him freely. She was loving from the fear of being left behind. And perhaps this love had never been about him. It was a journey to meet herself. That night, she returned to her room, closed her eyes, and went back to the beach in her visualization. The man was still there, his back to the sea. She walked closer, and for the first time, dared to touch his shoulder. When he turned around, she froze. It was Marco's face, but the eyes were her own. She understood. Marco was the living image of the part of her soul she had once rejected, the part that could love without needing proof, the part that could stand still without fear of losing anyone. He hadn't come to complete her. He had come to awaken her. After that day, Adriana began a new ritual. Whenever fear returned, she closed her eyes and went back to that beach. But this time, she no longer saw him. She only saw herself, standing in the sunset, peaceful, needing no witness. Months later, Marco left Florence. They parted quietly, without promises. Adriana didn't cry. She knew that love hadn't disappeared, it had transformed. A year passed. Each morning during meditation, she still visualized light spreading around her. No face appeared anymore, only a feeling of wholeness and stillness. Deep inside, she knew that love never leaves. It only changes form to guide us home. From then on, Adriana no longer needed visualization to believe in anything. She lived with a faith no longer born from willpower, but from presence. Each morning, looking at herself in the mirror, she didn't repeat affirmations or pray for strength. She simply smiled, because she had become the strength she once sought. Everything she once forced herself to believe, that she was enough, that she could, that life had meaning, was no longer belief, but reality. Because in the end, forcing yourself to believe is not deceiving yourself, but the first step to awaken the soul. Once the soul has awakened, faith is no longer something to hold, it becomes the life flowing through every breath. Adriana no longer needed to grasp anything to be unstoppable. She only needed to be present, and that presence, quiet yet steady, was what made life itself unable to stop her. For true strength isn't about never falling, but about rising through the light you found in the dark. And Adriana, like all of us, only needed to begin from that moment. The moment she believed, even just a little, that the light had always been within her. If you've reached the end of this story, perhaps you too have once had an image like Adriana's, a scene, a face, a feeling your soul saw before it became real. I want to ask you this. Is there something within you that longs to be visualized, named, trusted, even just a little? Maybe it's a dream you once set aside, a version of yourself you forgot. or simply a fragile feeling whispering, "I wasn't born to live like this." Let the deepest part of you speak. It doesn't need logic. It doesn't need reason. Number 13. When faith becomes a sacred act. When Adriana smiled at herself in the mirror, no longer needing affirmations, something within her had changed. Faith was no longer a thought, but a presence. And that is where the journey slowly comes to its close, when faith becomes a sacred act. There comes a moment in every human journey when every theory, every method, every effort becomes unnecessary. You no longer need to force yourself to believe, because life itself has become proof of belief. This is the stage where faith is no longer a psychological effort, but a ritual of the soul. When faith becomes sacred action, it resembles a heartbeat or breath, no longer something you try to maintain, but life sustaining itself through you. Every action, every word, carries the same rhythm, not faster, not slower, only aligned with the frequency of the soul. Jung once said, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." Wholeness lies in no formula of belief. It doesn't come from trying to be right or controlling yourself tightly to always think positively. It arises when you dare to live by the rhythm of your soul, where every part of you, fear, desire, weakness, and hope, is allowed to exist. When those seemingly opposite parts walk together on the same path, your actions, however small, carry a sacred quality, because they no longer come from ego, but from the self, the deepest center that unites consciousness and the unconscious. At this stage, believing in yourself no longer means repeating, "I can do it." It means your body, mind, and soul move in one rhythm. When you speak, act, or remain silent, all share the same frequency, the frequency of absolute trust. A friend of mine, a mountaineer named Eleanor, once told me about the moment she realized faith could become a ritual. She was not a professional athlete, nor an adventurer. She was a woman who had always feared heights, trembling before mountains, but that very fear led her to the greatest journey of her life. Eleanor began climbing when she was utterly lost. She had just ended a relationship, lost her job, and fallen into deep self-doubt. Every day she woke up numb, knowing she needed change but not knowing where to start. One morning, she saw a picture of the Alps in a magazine with the caption, "The summit is inside you." For some reason, the words made her cry. She signed up for an amateur climbing course, and there she learned the lesson Jung once emphasized. No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The first days were trembling. Each rock was a trial. The fear of falling, failing, not being strong enough, all roared inside her head. Yet she kept climbing, not because she believed in herself, but because she had nothing else to hold on to. Each morning, she forced herself to believe, not with words, but with steps. One more step, then another, though her knees shook and her breath trembled. Then one morning, as the sun rose, she stopped. The wind hit her face, her legs were weak, but something had shifted. She was no longer thinking of the summit. She no longer feared the fall. In the silence of the wind, she realized she was there, whole, awake, needing nothing more. "I didn't climb to prove I could," she said, "but to hear my soul again." From that moment, climbing was no longer a challenge. It was a ritual. Every step became a prayer. Every breath an affirmation. I am alive. I believe. That is the essence of this final stage, when faith is no longer an object to seek, but the energy animating your entire life. When you act from the deepest part of your soul, even the smallest things become sacred. You drink water, but with presence. You work not to prove worth, but to express the creative energy of your soul. You help others, not for recognition, but because your nature itself is love. At this level, you no longer practice belief, you practice soul. In Jung's language, this is the stage of individuation, the uniting of the ego and the self. When still in darkness, we think we must control life. But when the light of the self spreads, you no longer control, you are guided. You still work, love, and dream, but without tension, no longer anxious about doing right or wrong. Every act carries a sacred tone because you know it comes from the deepest place within, untouched by fear. And here lies the paradox. You only become truly unstoppable when you stop trying. Not because you give up, but because you understand there is nothing left to fight. The ego stops battling, the soul stops being divided. You and life are no longer two, you are life itself. This is the sacred action this chapter speaks of, when faith is no longer an idea in the mind, but infuses every act in the way you breathe, speak, love, create. Then you become the living embodiment of faith. If someone asks, "How do I know I've reached this stage?" I would answer, "You'll know when your actions no longer carry the taste of fear. When you send an email without worrying about the reply. When you love someone without needing to be loved back. When you speak the truth even if it costs you something. When you choose peace over proving yourself. Then you are no longer forcing yourself to believe. You are living as belief itself. And in that natural state, you become unstoppable. Not because you are stronger than others, but because nothing stands between you and life. Jung compared this process to a sacred ceremony. When one lives from the self, every act becomes ritual, no church needed, no prayer required, only full presence. You may be making coffee, writing, or holding someone, and in that moment, if you feel harmony between body, mind, and soul, you are performing the holiest act of all, living as yourself. For true faith isn't thinking everything will be fine, but knowing that no matter what happens, your soul remains luminous. One day, when you pause amid the chaos of the world, you'll realize there is no such thing as the end of the journey of belief, because that journey is life itself. And then, like Eleanor on the mountaintop, you'll understand, I didn't climb to prove I could. I climbed to remember that the summit was already within me. At that moment, you no longer ask, how do I believe? You simply breathe, and faith exists in every breath. That is absolute freedom, where faith is no longer a choice, but the natural frequency of your soul. And within that frequency, you become unstoppable, not because you hold more power, but because you have returned to your indestructible essence. And when you live in that frequency, you no longer need to try to believe, you simply live. Number 14, the discipline of the unstoppable. After faith has become sacred action, the journey doesn't end, it enters its quietest yet most decisive phase, spiritual discipline. Because faith, no matter how strong, must still be maintained, not through fear of losing it, but through reverence for the soul. The unstoppable are not those who never fall, but those who know how to rise with the awareness that every fall held meaning. There will be mornings when you don't feel strong. Yesterday's faith seems gone. leaving an empty chill in your chest. You feel lazy, tired, doubtful, unwilling to do anything. Yet it is on these days that discipline appears, not as a whip of force, but as a friend whispering